And after those envoys were so kind as to give you such a lovely new mirror, surely you don't need this one anymore. Why not bestow it on someone else? She plucked the mirror from Li Shu's slackened grip and smiled as she gave it an appraising look. She certainly wanted it for herself. Back. The sound came from consort Li Shu, but she was curling into herself. Her voice was as quiet as a fly, and the lady-in-waiting did not notice. She was too busy stuffing the mirror into the folds of her robe, like a juicy piece of loot. She was about to return and serve Jinchi his tea when Li Shu reached out and caught her sleeve. "Give it back. What's that, milady? Give it back." She tore at the woman's collar, grabbing the mirror. The former chief lady-in-waiting was aghast, and Li Shu's other women who had come bustling in belatedly wore frowns of their own. What a way to behave, and in front of guests. You should be ashamed of yourself. The weeping and the grabbing, taken in isolation, would seem to reflect poorly on consort Li Shu. She simply looked as if she had lost her temper. The other ladies-in-waiting may have thought she was upset about arriving late. However, Maomao, Jinchi and the others knew they were witnessing the end of a struggle. Jinchi moved first. "It seems that mirror is a personal treasure of hers. I wonder if it is wise to take it from her without fully understanding what it is." His tone was gentle and his words were carefully chosen, but it was unmistakably criticism. He stood before the lady-in-waiting who was straightening her collar and reached out one large hand. She blushed furiously because it looked as if he was going to stroke her hair. But then instead he pulled out the hair stick she was wearing. It was a beautiful piece, finely sculpted. Jinchi squinted at the crest it bore. "Was this also bestowed on you?" he asked. "Even if that is true, I am surprised you never learned that a lady-in-waiting who wears the crest of a high consort is reaching above her station." Once again his tone was gentle, and his smile never slipped, but that made it all the more frightening. Jinchi had to be well aware that consort Li Shu had been at the mercy of her ladies-in-waiting. He had refrained from making the matter public. It would have been ruinous to Li Shu's reputation. He also believed that as a eunuch, it was simply not business in which he ought to be involved. Now that he had physical proof in his hands, he was free to speak his mind. And he would drive the point home as hard as he could. "In the future, I hope you will refrain from overstepping yourself," he said. That unutterably lovely smile was on his face. The former chief lady-in-waiting simply crumpled to the floor. The other women, evidently remembering trespasses of their own, had all gone pale. "Wow, is he scary?" Maomao thought. Jinchi was sipping his tea as if nothing had happened at all. Chapter 4. The rumoured eunuchs in the medical office. Maomao the kitten was wrapped around the quack doctor's leg, pleading for a fish. As usual, the office was open, but it had very few patients. Maomao, not the kitten, was researching herbs that could be used as anesthetics. She had asked the doctor about the procedure for making eunuchs as soon as she returned to the rear palace. She had learned a little from her old man, but not enough. She had hoped to learn more from the quack doctor, but true to form, he wasn't able to tell her anything her father hadn't. He asked at it again, "Young lady." His lips were pursed, and he wore a dejected look. Maomao the kitten was easily able to bat the fish out of his hand and steal it away. Perhaps thanks to her improved diet, her fur had grown lustrous. It really would make a wonderful brush, but so far Gaishun and the doctor had prevented Maomao from plucking any of the kitten's hair. They don't make eunuchs anymore. No need to learn how to do it. His expression turned distant. It must have been terribly painful. Maomao had a thought. "How do the eunuchs get into the rear palace?" she asked. The doctor dangled a stalk of foxtail for the kitten to swipe at as he replied, "How?" "They had surgery to become eunuchs." "No, that is not what I mean." She wanted to know how they were determined to be eunuchs. "In the past, you could enter if you had written proof of the surgery." But now the quack flushed and ducked his head, looking a bit embarrassed. He seemed as unworldly as Li Shu. These days they feel for them. They want to see if anything is there. Do they grab at it? "What a question, miss," the doctor said, sounding exasperated. Such inspections hadn't been common in the past, but there had been too many cases of people trying to pass themselves off as eunuchs, so the checks were implemented. People forged the documents or they obtained proxy papers. Some people will do anything for a few coins. The inspections were conducted by 3 officials, and each one represented a different department of the government. Previously, the doctor told her, they had conducted visual inspections of the would-be rear palace entrance. However, some of the officials found themselves rather discomforted by the process, and so it was done away with. Huh. Maomao tilted her head with curiosity. She asked if this inspection happened only the first time a eunuch entered the rear palace. The guard said no, it happened each time in principle. However, once they recognized you, they usually let you pass right through. Maomao did not say anything immediately. She continued to lean her head to one side as she gazed at the anesthetic herbs. Perhaps, but she shook her head, saying no. The doctor turned from the kitten and changed the subject. It was similar to the previous topic. He said, speaking of eunuchs, did you know that some new ones have joined us? I've heard rumors. Yes, he replied, these are younger men for the first time in quite a while. I think they are proving quite a distraction. He touched his loach-like moustache and sighed. Usually becoming a eunuch cost a man any specific signs of masculinity. However, in some cases like the quacks, a moustache or something similar might remain. It was perhaps the doctor's only source of pride. Young women, especially the more innocent ones, were often fastidious about cleanliness. They preferred eunuchs with their almost gender-neutral appearance to men with too much body hair or intimidating demeanors. The doctor went on, saying, the fuss is extra big this time because there are a lot of pretty ones. Currently they are still working behind the scenes, so everything is fine. However, if one of them proves capable enough to be promoted to a higher position, it could be a real problem. I hope things calm down before then. It was funny how the quack sounded like none of this concerned him when he was on tenterhooks every time Jinchi was around. He could already comment on the eunuch's appearance, so he must have seen them right after they were checked. Someone told him there was quite a scene when one of the lower consorts became too interested in one of the new eunuchs while he was heating the baths. He hummed in response. I suppose such behavior cannot be ignored, Maomao said. Lower consorts rarely had any hope of attracting the emperor's attention. An unsatisfied woman was not a rarity in the rear palace. No doubt there were a few palace ladies who had taken eunuch lovers. It was a tough life, Maomao thought as she began to clean up the herbs. When are you going to tell her? It was the umpteenth time he had asked. Jinchi glared across at his attendant. In good time. Oh yes, in good time. Of course. Gaoshan was standing beside the desk in Jinchi's office, acting studiously unmoved. His brow was furrowed, but that was typical for him. I understand how nervous you are, but you are acting a bit too overt about it, and it is making things worse. With any other palace woman, that would be enough. Zairamo appeared as if she were looking at a snail that had lost its shell. In other words, a slug. Pipe down already, Jinchi grumbled. He looked at the papers. He separated them into those that were feasible and those that were not. Then he began applying his chop. No one else was in the office. The soldier standing guard outside was probably yawning to himself. The place was set up so they would know the moment anyone approached. It was only under these circumstances that Gaoshan would speak to him about a matter like this. Jinchi slammed his chop down, then passed the bundle of papers to Gaoshan. The other man accepted them without a word. He straightened the papers and placed them in a basket that an underling would take away. You have to make your decision soon, or it will come back to haunt you, Gaoshan said. Are you sure it's not better this way? Jinchi knew perfectly well what Gaoshan was thinking. He was suggesting Jinchi should bring the apothecary girl Maomao completely into his fold. This meant, Jinchi added, it would bring the strategist out of the woodwork, I can tell you that. He could see it now. The monocled man would stick his nose in. He was crazy about his little girl. He was also an unknown quantity, someone even the emperor had to keep an eye on. Gaoshan said calmly, then fight poison with poison, as it were. Lacan, known as the strategist, occupied a unique position within the palace. He officially held the title of Grand Commandant. However, he belonged to no particular faction, and he had not formed a new one himself. He drifted where he pleased. He was the nail that stuck up, and normally he would have been pounded down long ago. But he hadn't been. The man who had taken back his inheritance from his blood father and half-brother more than 10 years before now led the La clan. He was a warrior fully worthy of the name. His astonishing genius powered a meteoric rise through the ranks. Many regarded him as an eyesore, and more than a few, so one heard, had tried to knock him off his perch. But Lacan was the one who survived. He did more than burn those who tried to stop him. One man had even found his entire family scattered to the winds. The frightening thing was that neither rank nor blood intimidated Lacan. No one could tell what was going on in that man's head. He could see things that others could not, and he used them to write a script that dragged his opponents down to the utmost depths. Therefore, the inhabitants of the palace had a tacit understanding. One did not have anything to do with Lacan unless it was strictly necessary. If you did not hurt him, he would not hurt you, but having nothing to do with him also meant not making him your ally. Jinshi said, all my papers would get covered in grease, remembering how Lacan had not hesitated to eat oily snacks in his office. Gaeshun said, we would just have to live with it, adding another crease to his brow. He wasn't particularly pleased with the method, but he still wanted to tell Maomao the truth. He wanted to disregard her family's status and explain what was really happening. He wanted her to understand why she and everyone else were in their current situation, and why they had needed to keep it hidden. Yes, he wanted her to know the truth. At the same time, he was mildly terrified of how she might react. Jinshi let out a long sigh and decided to get started on his next job. This was rear palace work, written requests submitted by the consorts to the master of the place. Seems to be quite a few of them today. Yes, said Gaeshun. The usual matter, I presume. Perhaps also items related to events the other day. The seals were already broken. Someone, perhaps another official, must have checked them over already. Jinshi opened the first missive and gave it a quick look, then he picked up the second. He looked at a third lady and then a fourth. He gradually settled into his chair until he found himself gazing up at the ceiling, pressing the spot just under his eyes. A good half of the material concerned just one of the four ladies, Lulan. The grievances were varied. She had more ladies in waiting than the other palace women. Her outfits were too gaudy and seemed to spoil the palace's scenery. These were familiar complaints, largely motivated by jealousy. Nothing new occurred. Aside from that, there was a report that some of the palace ladies were looking at the new eunuchs with romantic interest. I could have seen that coming, Jinshi muttered. Yes, sir. The newly arrived eunuchs had all been assigned to behind-the-scenes work. Their jobs included heating the bathwater, cleaning the laundry, and other tasks that mostly involved simple strength. The number of eunuchs had decreased as the number of palace women increased. Therefore, physical labor became the main task for the eunuchs. If a eunuch showed a special talent, he might be moved to a department that could use his skills. However, these eunuchs had once been slaves from barbarian tribes, so careful consideration was needed. The women would eventually lose their enthusiasm, but for appearances he needed to monitor things for now. What a headache. Life goes on, sir. Jinshi finished his paperwork with many exchanges like this, and so Jinshi arrived at the rear palace the next day to observe the new eunuchs. He asked the person in charge of daily tasks in the rear palace about how the new arrivals were doing. Heating the bathwater and doing the laundry both required well water, after all. Jinshi looked around as they spoke. He saw 5 people he believed were the newcomers. They all wore white sashes because they hadn't yet been assigned to a specific department. These newcomers were younger than the other eunuchs. Their faces looked drawn, perhaps showing the time they had spent in slavery. They appeared withdrawn, perhaps as a result of their time with the tribes. Their fearful movements suggested they had been under the barbarians' control for a long time. Jinshi and the current emperor both wanted to reduce the staff of the rear palace, but this was another part of the problem. These people had been castrated and enslaved, so they needed time to adjust to their freedom. Serving at the rear palace was a good way to help them adjust. As he watched them, Jinshi understood the root of the issue. One of the newcomers had a positively lovely face. It looked gender-neutral as eunuch faces tended to do, but hollow cheeks gave it a gallant touch. However, the eunuch seemed to avoid using his left hand in his work. What's the matter with him? Jinshi asked. It seems he was beaten severely, badly enough to cause some paralysis on the left side of his body. They were also told he was horribly scarred, so he tried to show a minimum of skin. I see. Getting water from the bath wouldn't be the best job for him then. He was weaker than the other eunuchs, and thus slower at his work. Meanwhile, the tendency of his face to attract admirers made him unsuited to assignment in the popular southern quarter. Quite popular, isn't he? Yes, he is very intelligent and most considerate toward the ladies. At a distance they could see some palace women talking. Gaeshun looked hard at Jinshi. What? Look who's talking, he said with some annoyance. Indeed, Jinshi had attracted his usual gallery. They directed their most charming looks at him. He smiled in return, but walked toward the eunuch with as much business-like composure as he could manage. As he neared the newcomers, the more seasoned eunuchs gave them a gentle nudge. They understood the signal and bowed their heads. Their arms, where they stuck out from their sleeves, looked abused. Jinshi saw welts that he thought were from whipping. He could understand why they might want to cover themselves. Even as he noticed all of this, Jinshi knew he could show no obvious reaction. He offered the new eunuchs a short encouragement to work diligently. He assured them that hard work could lead to advancement. He was preparing to depart when a crash occurred. He turned toward the noise, curious about its source. A palace woman stood there looking pale and stunned. A eunuch was shouting at her, his face red with anger. Next to them a cart had been overturned. Its contents, precious ice carefully cushioned in reeds and cloth, were spilled across the ground. The ice was likely intended for one of the emperor's consorts. The stores in the ice chambers were getting low at this time. This made an already rare resource even more valuable. Jinshi thought he recognized the terrified young lady. He was still trying to figure out where he had seen her when another woman rushed up. Another familiar lady, small and a little aloof. Ah, so this young woman was a friend of Maomao. That explained why she looked so familiar. He wasn't quite sure what to do next, so he decided to wait and see how things developed. Chapter 5 Ice. Xiaolan was supposed to be 2 years younger than Maomao. She had been sold into the rear palace by her family, but there was no hint of this dark past in her personality. Perhaps it was her poor farmer's background that gave her insatiable appetite for sweets. Show her a snack and she would promptly stuff her mouth with it. She worried about losing her job when she left the rear palace. She had been learning to write and making connections to prepare for life after her contract ended. It was a very professional approach. She was still young in some ways, and this showed as occasional bouts of anxiety. One of the attendants at the bath seemed to have taken a liking to her and had given her a small hair stick. It was a minor thing, but Xiaolan, who had been thrilled to receive even a hairband, was over the moon about it. She had been joyful just a moment earlier. She was running without looking where she was going and ran into a cart that was stopped in her path. And so we find ourselves at the present moment. What am I supposed to do now? There is no time to get a new load. The eunuch who had been pulling the cart full of ice shouted at her in a nasal voice. The cargo was scattered pathetically on the ground. It is not like I can just wash it off and pretend nothing happened. I am IMSS, she was trying to apologize, but the eunuch continued to press her. Xiaolan was white as a sheet and trembling all over. Perhaps you think it is just ice, but this was the season when the cicadas were still trilling. Ice chambers in cool mountain regions had been filled during the winter. Now in the hot season, chunks were cut from the great mass of ice. Each of the pieces lying on the ground at that moment was probably worth enough to buy a human life. Arg, what the hell am I going to do? The eunuch's anger was understandable. He might not be hanged for this offense, but a good beating likely awaited him. He grabbed his hood and flung it to the ground. Meanwhile, the ice was melting away all too quickly. Maomao crouched on the ground and picked up one of the muddy chunks. It was still wrapped in some reeds and cloth. Which consort was it intended for? She asked the eunuch, grasping at the slightest sliver of hope. Only so many ladies could have requested such a large load of ice. It could have been one of the emperor's 4 favored women, or perhaps a middle consort with a very rich family. Consort Lulan, the eunuch said. Maomao's shoulders slumped. They could have reasoned with the other high consorts, but it had to be Lulan. She loved displays of wealth, and had likely planned to enjoy the evening cool while eating an ice treat. The eunuch was correct. They could not give her something that had been in the mud. I am just glad Shisui and Sekiyu are not here, Maomao thought. Neither of them had been at the great bathhouse today. They both had other things to do. Shisui alone might have been manageable. She had a surprisingly composed and collected side, but if Sekiyu had been with them, she would have started crying or shouting and only would have added to the confusion. Now what? Maomao wondered. The amount of money was far beyond what they could hope to pay back. More importantly, they were in danger of angering one of the upper consorts. If only they had something that could substitute for ice. Maomao looked at the shattered ice. They could not simply wash it off and still use the ice. But she asked, holding up a piece of the reed-wrapped ice, what is going to happen to this? The eunuch snapped, nothing. It is lost now. Do what you want with it. The eunuch was obviously thoroughly angered. He was certainly thinking hard about what excuse would save him. The ice was valuable anyway, so it would not be useful to just let it melt. Xirolan stood there, her face pale, and her thoughts were likely frozen by fear of the punishment she might receive. Maomao scratched her head.